Welcome to Behind the Prop Podcast, where each week we will bring you stories, lessons, and some tips from behind the prop. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Pre-show checklist. Microphones.
Check.
Sound check.
Complete.
Recording all channels.
Checked and verified. Pre-show checklist complete.
Tower. Bravo Tango Papa is holding short, ready for departure.
Bravo Tango Papa, you are clear for takeoff. Have a great show.
You're clear for takeoff and Wilco. Bravo Tango Papa.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm good. Here we are. This is episode 2, and while we're still in our infancy, I know we've got a lot of great shows lined up and a lot of great content that we want to share with the listeners. Today, we are tackling what I call is a big one. We're talking about checklist usage. Wally, have you ever seen someone make a mistake with a checklist on a check ride?
How many check rides have I given, Bobby? 400 or so. Probably that many mistakes. Probably the most common mistake in checklist is not using a checklist.
Not using it.
And if you read the ACS, for sure for every landing, one of the skills elements is proper use of checklists. So if you're not using the checklist, how can that be proper use?
No doubt. No doubt. So today we're going to break it down into kind of 3 topic areas, and we were joking before we started. We could talk probably for hours about checklist usage and checklist in general, but we're going to talk a little bit about usage first, kind of which ones. There's a lot of third parties out there that have made stuff. In the advent of electronic flight bags, we've seen ForeFlight, and there's a lot of starting points, but I'm afraid I've seen some people maybe use what comes as a good starting point for a Cessna 172, but miss a number of extra components on that are important to their aircraft. Then we're going to talk a little bit about common mistakes, and then we'll talk best practices, and we'll wrap up the show.
Sounds good.
So let's talk about these things. I'm a flight school owner here in Houston, and we have a pilot supply. We sell checklists that we've made, really just to make the cost recovery of the lamination that we've done. We also have some checkmate checklists up there, which I'm sure many people have heard about, but it's a third-party company that's done their best to put together a list of things you should do in a Bonanza or a Cessna or a Travel Air or whatever you might be flying. And I, as a tech guy, have recreated almost every checklist for every plane I've ever flown in a format that I like to use, and maybe made a mistake by forgetting something. That's a risk, right? Any other ideas or thoughts that you've seen with checklists? We talked ForeFlight too. I guess that's a whole nother one, right? Like all the electronic apps and tools.
Yeah, the thing I would say, if you're going to use an other than POH checklist, which is permissible, is to just really make sure that it matches that checklist. Now, a lot of the POH checklists will have references to equipment that you may not have on the airplane, for instance, air conditioner or autopilot, and you may not have that in your airplane. So does it make sense to create your own and remove those and declutter things, kind of clean things up? Yeah, I would say it does, but just make sure that the things that are on the POH checklist are on your checklist, the ones that need to be there. And don't, if you're going to go to an FBO or a flight school and rent an airplane, don't just assume. Make sure that they're correct.
I would not just trust my checklist. If I was an outsider and I walked in here, I would definitely be doing some thorough investigating. And then there's some safety tips that you might add, right? There's nothing wrong with creating your own checklist and adding a few extra things.
Right.
I can remember I used to, before ForeFlight did it automatically for you, I used to have start my track log on my ForeFlight before I left my run-up position because I didn't want to be doing it on the go, of course.
Right.
But it was something I didn't want to forget to do. So nothing wrong with adding start ForeFlight as a checklist item on your checklist.
Right. I do some things in my airplanes. I own 2 airplanes, and one thing I have on my parking checklist is to squawk 1200. If I'm on a flight plan where I have a squawk code in there, I want to go to 1200 there because the next flight when I go out, If I look over there, if I know I'm on an IFR flight plan, I look over there, I see 1200. I know that's not the right squawk code. So that's something that I have added to mine, like you talked about.
Yeah, good best practices for sure. What I'm sure you've seen many different versions of or flavors of, but let's use Checkmate as an example. Not an endorsement and not a negative comment, but have you seen holes in their things? Have you seen things that people might misinterpret? Have you worried about maybe the usage of a checklist like that?
I have, and one of the, when I do check rides, I am going to we're going to incorporate the systems portion of the oral within the context of talking about a flight, and so I am. As per the ACS, I'm required to talk about 3 different systems. And so one of the systems that I occasionally talk about is the electrical system. So we will talk about an electrical system failure, or basically an alternator failure, which possibly could lead to an electrical system failure. And if you read the Checkmate checklist, it basically tells you we cannot restore the alternator, it says to land ASAP. And I think most of us would, when we hear ASAP, we think it means as soon as possible. If you go into the Cessna checklist, the 172 checklist within the POH, it says land as soon as practical. And that's quite a bit of difference. You could make the argument that if you're 30 miles from your destination, that's probably about 15 or 20 minutes in a Cessna 172. Is it practical to continue on to your destination when you're right on top of a potential diversion airport? And it could be. I can't say diverting to the airport that you're right on top of would be the wrong thing either, as long as the airport is open and safe and suitable for you. But when I hear ASAP, if I got a text from somebody that said, call me ASAP, I would really stop what I'm doing and call them right away. If I got a text from somebody that said, call me as soon as practical, I'd probably wait till I'm finished doing what I'm doing. So that is, I don't know what Checkmate intended. I don't know if they intended for it to say, if they meant it to say as soon as practical and decided to save a line of text and put it as ASAP. I don't know.
Yeah, that's another point that I would say. Sometimes I don't necessarily understand every abbreviation on someone else's checklist, whether it's Checkmate or not. People have their own shorthand, their own abbreviation. We have a twin that we use to train in a lot, and someone made a magnificent looking checklist. I mean, it was as sexy as a checklist can be sexy. It was sexy, but it was so much shorthand on it. The twin's complicated for a guy who's only flown single engines his whole aviation career. Add on top of it all these shortened words that I might not understand. I didn't want to incorporate that. As bad as I wanted that checklist to work for me, I just couldn't make it work because there were more acronyms than the normal acronyms on a checklist, and had to forego it and then ultimately create my own from the POH and then add some of the steps that I thought I wanted to do. Instead, I think on the original POH kind of had you check all the lights and then get back in the cockpit for something and then go check the stall warning. Well, that might have not been an electric stall warning when they first built the plane, but now it's got an electric stall on it. So it makes sense to put that in the light walk around and check so you can tap up on it and hear the horn. And it's kind of out of place, right?
Right.
It's not bad or wrong to change things if they're practically making sense, as long as you check all the items you need to check, right?
Right. I began my airline career as a second officer on a Boeing 727, which was a 3-pilot airplane. And so the second officer on that airplane was basically the systems guy. And he was also basically the checklist, the guy who ran all the checklists, whether it be normal or non-normal checklists. So, and I actually taught on that airplane. I was a check airman and an aircrew program designee on the 727 for several years. So I've got a lot of experience on that airplane, and I got to dive into checklist philosophies and and basically how to run a checklist. And what I learned, and I continue to learn this today, is that sometimes when we are reading a checklist that we are unfamiliar with, which is typically a non-normal checklist, something that we don't really use every day, that we have difficulty reading the checklist. It's conceptually, it's something that's pretty simple. Read the checklist. Read every word on the checklist. Don't add any words, and don't skip any words. And I use the comparison of paying your electric bill. If you get electric bill for $247.18, you send them $247.18. You don't send them $250. You don't send them $240. You pay them exactly what they ask for. So when we read a checklist, we want to read every word, and we don't want to add any words. And here's the point. So if you have the left side of the checklist, say it says landing light, and the right side says on. Well, landing light is basically the subject of the sentence, and on is the verb of the sentence. So you would say landing light on, and then you'd reach over and you turn the landing light on. If we take one word, and that word is, and we put it in the middle of landing light and on, it changes the whole meaning of the sentence. I say landing light is on. Well, I don't have to do anything then. So it sounds like a very, very, I don't know, maybe I'm doing some wordsmithing here, but just read the checklist. Don't add words. Don't take words away. And especially if there are notes, read the notes, because the notes may say, they may give you conditions. Well, hey, if you're in, I don't know, in bigger airplanes, if you're in icing conditions, don't do this step for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I think as a guy who flies my family and friends around, I probably don't use a checklist enough. I have got fixated on a single aircraft that I fly 90% of the time. I find myself using checklists more in the ones that I don't fly regularly, but I think it's a practice that we should all use the checklist more than not, and make sure we're using one that we know verifies everything that's in the POH. What about, we've talked about a few of these, but common mistakes. So I would say on a check ride, Wally, you probably see people at their best more often than not, meaning I'm taking my private with Wally today. I'm walking around that plane. I've got that checklist in my hand. I see you standing over there at the wingtip watching me walk around, and I'm like, sump wing, and I say it out loud, and I check it on the checklist with a dry erase marker, and I sump the wing, and I look to see if you saw me do all those things, right? You're seeing me my best.
Yeah.
What do you think happens that next day when me takes my friend and I go flying?
Yeah, and I tell people, I tell my applicants, I want you to do this the way you're going to do this tomorrow when you take your family on an airplane ride. This is a really a good example of it. Let's face it, if we're in a Cessna 172, say, especially if it's a fuel-injected 172, there's not a whole lot to the landing checklist. Maybe mixture, maybe landing light, flaps, maybe. There's not a whole lot to it. But what I explain to the applicant is that pretty quickly they're going to outgrow the 172. And a year down the road, they're going to be flying a Bonanza. Well, a Bonanza has a lot more things to it. It's got cowl flaps. It's got prop, a controllable pitch prop. And most importantly, it's got wheels that go up and down. And
you don't want to forget that.
You don't want to forget that. That makes for a very rough landing. So it's just a habit pattern. Even with the airline. I mean, the airplane I fly, there are 3 things on the landing checklist, and I know what they are. but we still pull out the card and we read them every time.
Yep, that's I think a common mistake that I had early on was, you talked about reading earlier. I think I wanted to be fast, and I'm sure you've seen this. I'm sure people try to impress you on every check ride in some form or another, and I think I tried to be quick, and maybe during the run up I'm quick, and my instructor would always say, "Did you get all of them?" And normally, if your instructor or a DP says that,
right,
I can assure you haven't got all of them.
Yeah.
So I found myself, almost skipping stigmatism, almost jumping over these line items, which is important. I think as I now have the opportunity to fly with people that are rated pilots as well, obviously you see a lot of mistakes. You have a different view than you normally would, and they're doing all the hard work. You can just pick them apart. I think common mistakes that I see is a lot of it's not really pretending that they're doing the work, but they skim over the work, right? I see when I fly with people, I've flown with some CFI candidates who are trying to teach, and they're going through the motions, and they go through like this flow with the checklist, but they don't really look to see if things are really done. They say them, they point, but they might not really verify. Have you seen that in your tenure where people do that?
Yeah, all the time, and primarily where I see it is in light switches. It may say landing light on, and they reach down and they confirm that a switch is in the on position, but it might actually be the beacon or the nav lights. And I think you see this, primarily in people that are flying at flight schools where every airplane is not exactly configured exactly the same. But I do see that quite a bit. And again, I've watched many applicants read a checklist with it upside down, and I'll usually make a little bit of a sarcastic comment to them about that, and then they flip it over and have it right side up at this point. So obviously, it's pretty obvious when they're holding the checklist and it's upside down that they're not really using it, that they're trying to put on a show for
Sure.
me, and that's it's just a bad habit, and I get it. I know on most of these airplanes there's just not a whole lot on the checklists, but we're not teaching them to fly a PA-28 or a Cessna 172. We're trying to we're trying to teach them correct habit patterns.
Yeah, and as we talk about this one, as a flight school owner, one of my biggest pet peeves, because windshields aren't cheap to replace, and they craze, and I just don't like taking the plane out of service. But a lot of my planes are sitting probably out there on the tarmac right now, Wally, with a checklist crammed down in the side of the windshield. What would a professional pilot, if a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper was blocking your view from my side to your side, what would you tell that pilot to do with that checklist?
Yeah, I'd tell them to get it out of there, and I see that a lot with people bringing their own iPad mounts.
And
they mount it right on the left side, and I'm thinking, boy, we've just taken out about 20% of your forward visual ability.
But they're thinking, but Wally, how am I going to see my iPad if I don't?
I know, exactly.
You want to see what's in front of you, and they want to see ForeFlight in that magenta line.
Exactly. Yeah, I want to see the airplane by looking at it and seeing out the window, and they want to see a little blip on the iPad.
Yes. Well, I think if we're talking common mistakes, cramming it in the side of the windshield and creating a blind spot for both the pilot and maybe a passenger that they could be using as a crew member, even in a light GA aircraft, is a big problem. And then the iPad's even worse. If you use your iPad as a checklist, putting it on the window right in front of where you're looking, it's terrible. And I stop CFIs that are training people when I see someone taxiing with the big iPad mounted on the windshield, kind of in the corner. As you said, it's 20% of their viewable area.
Right.
I don't care how proficient they are. They're not going to be able to move a Cessna out of the way of a jet that they didn't see.
Right.
So
Exactly.
we got to get those mistakes cleaned up as it relates to usage with checklists. I guess now best practices. Some best practices with checklist usage might not sound like the coolest thing in the world, but it may really save your life one day. I become a big fan of a trifold checklist, something that's in my knee board, something that I can have really accessible in multiple places.
Yeah.
Console in the bag, not crammed in the window, but in the bag, the pouch of the door, but most preferably on my leg, that I have quick access to it. As you said, there's not a whole lot of steps. Some of them have acronyms, but we should be verifying with the checklist even if we do a flow.
Yeah, and I try to when I'm instructing, what I teach my students to is when you're studying, when you're looking at the POH, something that's very worthwhile to study or to familiarize yourself with would be a better word or phrase, is the table of contents of each section. What is in the POH? What checklist do I have available to me? For instance, getting back to the electrical system failure, I will occasionally say to an applicant, okay, if we are flying along and we are right here, and I'll point to where we are on the sectional, and I will say, you have an indication of an alternator failure. What are you going to do? And really what I want to hear from them is, I'm going to pull out the checklist. And I'd say in 85, 90%, they start going through procedures. Some of them will say, I'm going to divert right away.
Find a place to land, something that they've practiced
exactly.
or been taught. Yeah.
Now, the checklist in most airplanes will have you go through a little bit of a reset procedure. And you might get that alternator back. So you don't have a problem. It happens
all the time. When you're flying 14 planes at a location, day in, day out, all the time, you'd be surprised how many times that alternator does come back.
Yeah, and the example I will use to them, I will say, okay, so let's say you choose to divert, and you go land, and you go land at this airport that isn't where you're supposed to go, and you get there, and they've got no mechanic there, no maintenance there. What are you going to do? And they say, well, I don't know. I said, well, you're at some point you're going to make the awkward call to the flight school owner, right? And they say, yeah. And I said, so what are you gonna say when you call them? And they will say, well, I'm going to tell them that I diverted to XYZ airport because I lost the alternator. And the flight school owner is going to say to you, did you adhere to the POH procedure? And what are you going to say? And they get this look of, oh no, oops. So again, and then I will also give an applicant scenarios of that relate to the systems that we might not have a checklist for. And obviously that's a time where we do have to improvise. I mean, I'll maybe talk about a fuel leak. Most of these small airplanes, there's nothing in the POH that addresses a fuel leak. But we'll talk about how might you handle a fuel leak. And obviously that's a scenario where you're going to have to improvise, and you're going to have to logically think through things and, what you're going to do with that fuel selector and so forth.
Yep. Another best practice that I have seen is the ease of use of a checklist. So to use the POH, we're not going to all walk around with a notebook that's in some cases 50 years old in our knee board that we're going to open up. But in the same respect, using that POH PDF version on a knee board is probably not very good either. There's a lot of electronic options for clicking through, but I find best literally nothing better than a really big fonted checklist that I can see and go through step by step, as you said, not adding a bunch of words. I see people that rewrite their own checklists that almost reauthor the POH, the procedures.
Right.
So many words, so many paragraphs that can't be useful. And then, like the example I said, had so many acronyms that might not be useful either. But somewhere in between, as a now 47-year-old man who's losing his eyes a little more every day, the bigger, the better, in my opinion. And I think the old me, the 44-year-old me 3 years ago that could see, I might have tried to make that thing as small as I could for simplicity's sake,
Right.
for storage sake.
Right.
And that's not a best practice as it relates to using checklists.
Right.
Make it as big as you can feasibly store and use and see so that you can get through it for sure.
Yeah.
What about, I guess one thing I've learned as I finished my commercial and multi recently, what are your thoughts on maybe not during a check ride, but let's say you fly somewhere with one of your daughters. What's your expectation of them using you as a crew resource to help with things like a checklist?
As far as the checklist, I would expect them to use the checklist. Now, if we're in an abnormal situation, I would definitely expect them to use me. I actually had a situation. We've got a Saratoga, and we had an electrical system failure in it. And
what was the first thing you did?
Fly the airplane.
And then you grabbed the checklist.
Yeah. And, of course, it involved a manual gear extension. I had my youngest daughter in the left seat. I was in the right seat. And my eldest daughter and wife were in the back of the airplane. And my eldest daughter and I, she was reading the manual gear extension checklist. I had my youngest daughter, again, in the left seat, who at the time was a student pilot. She was flying the airplane. And I had my wife calling the local airport to get someone to come out to verify that the gear was down as we flew by. So all four of us were involved in the abnormal situation. And if I'd have been by myself, and it was a clear blue day, there was not a cloud in the sky, beautiful weather. But if I had have been by myself, it would have been a challenge.
Yeah, so I'll just say, depending on the situation, a best practice might be to use someone else.
Yeah.
No matter what the circumstance is, no matter what the phase of flight, if you feel overwhelmed and you have someone that can help, ask for help.
Absolutely.
Use the crew resources that are available to you, and don't try to make it work because you think a better pilot could do it on their own. Ask for help. There's probably a million more best practices that we could relate to, but the biggest one of all is to use a checklist. Don't get caught in an aircraft without a checklist for sure, and make sure that checklist encompasses all the items on the POH. We have a lot of more good shows coming. Wally, anything to wrap with today?
No.
We thank you all for listening to Behind the Prop. Hopefully you're enjoying these lessons and stories from Behind the Prop. Until next week, that's the show.
Bravo Tango Papa, we are clear of the active runway and would like the taxi to park.
Bravo Tango Papa, taxi to park. Great show. Have a nice day.
Taxi to park, thanks. You too, Bravo Tango Papa.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Prop. Please follow us on social media @Behind the Prop or visit our website www.behindtheprop.com. Until next week, fly safe, everyone.